Commander Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of the UES Liberty and watched the stars shift on the main screen as they moved through space toward the Vega system. The ship was humanity's best exploration vessel, built with the latest technology, and crewed by some of the finest people Earth had to offer. Jake had been exploring space for 15 years, but he had never seen anything like the energy readings they were picking up from this distant system. The science officer, Dr. Elena Vasquez, looked up from her console with worry in her eyes. "Commander, these readings are unlike anything in our databases. The energy patterns are too organized to be natural phenomena, but too complex to be from any known technology." Jake nodded and turned to the communications officer. "Lisa Martinez, keep scanning all frequencies. If there's intelligent life out here, I want to know about it before they know about us." Captain Ryan Cole, the ship's military commander, stepped forward. "Sir, recommend we proceed with caution. Unknown technology usually means unknown weapons." Ryan had fought in the Mars colonial wars and knew better than most what happened when humans encountered something they didn't understand. The Liberty continued its approach to Vega Prime, the fourth planet in the system where the energy readings were strongest. As they drew closer, the crew began to see something that made them all stop and stare. Massive ships hung in space around the planet, but they weren't like any ships humans had ever built. These vessels seemed to be made of crystal and light, their surfaces reflecting the star's radiation in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "My God," whispered Lisa Martinez. "There must be 50 of them, each one the size of a city." Dr. Vasquez was studying the readings from her instruments. "The energy signatures are coming from the ships themselves. They're using some kind of technology that bends space around them. It's like they're not entirely in our dimension." Before Jake could respond, alarms began ringing throughout the ship. The alien vessels had detected them and were moving in their direction at incredible speed. In seconds, the Liberty was surrounded by 5 of the crystal ships, each one easily large enough to destroy the human vessel without effort. Lisa's console came to life with an incoming transmission. The voice that came through the speakers was unlike anything any human had ever heard. It seemed to speak in harmony with itself, as if multiple beings were talking at the same time, but in perfect agreement. "Greetings, small vessel of the species called humans. We are the Zephyrian Collective. We have observed your kind spreading across nearby star systems. We offer you the gift of joining the Great Convergence." Jake stepped forward. "This is Commander Jake Harrison of the United Earthship Liberty. We come in peace and wish to establish diplomatic relations with your people." The voice continued without acknowledging his words. "Your species shows signs of intelligence, but remains trapped in the prison of individual thought. We offer freedom from the chaos of separate minds. Join the collective and know peace. Your resistance will end. Your conflicts will cease. And your people will find purpose as part of something greater." Dr. Vasquez was working frantically at her station, analyzing the transmission. She looked up at Jake with alarm. "Commander, I'm detecting neural interference patterns in their communication. This isn't just a message, it's some kind of mental probe." Ryan Cole had moved to the weapons console. "Sir, they're not asking for surrender. They're demanding it, and based on what I'm seeing here, they have the firepower to enforce that demand." The alien voice spoke again. "We have brought 47 species into the convergence. Each has found joy in the unity of shared consciousness. Your individual minds will be preserved as part of the greater whole. You will retain your memories, but gain the wisdom of countless others. This offer is given once. Accept now or face the consequences of continued separation." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. These beings weren't talking about alliance or trade. They were talking about the complete elimination of human individuality. Everything that made humans what they were, their ability to think independently, to disagree, to make their own choices, would be gone. "What happened to the species that refused your offer?" Jake asked. None have refused. The logic of unity is clear to all intelligent life. Individual consciousness is a burden that creates suffering, conflict, and inefficiency. We remove this burden. Lisa Martinez had been monitoring other frequencies, and she looked up with horror. "Commander, I'm picking up transmissions from the conquered worlds. The populations are still there, but they're all speaking in unison, thinking the same thoughts. It's like they've become living machines." Jake looked around at his crew. These were people who had chosen to explore the unknown, who valued discovery and freedom above safety and comfort. The idea of surrendering their ability to think and choose for themselves was worse than death. "I need to consult with my crew and my government before we can give you an answer," Jake said. "Consultation requires individual thought, which creates inefficiency and conflict. You will join the convergence now, or your species will be marked for correction. We begin the process in your home system in 72 of your hours." The transmission ended, and the alien ships began to move away. Jake knew they had just witnessed something that would change humanity forever. The Zephyrians weren't just another alien species. They were something that threatened the very essence of what it meant to be human. Admiral Karen Brooks stood in the command center of Sol Defense Command, watching as red warning lights flashed across every screen in the room. The reports were coming in from 12 human colonies at the same time, and they all said the same. Terrible thing. The Zephyrians had arrived, and the invasion had begun. "Ma'am, we're receiving emergency transmissions from New Geneva, Kepler Station, Ross Colony, and 9 other settlements," reported Communications Officer Bill Johnson. "The enemy fleets appeared without warning and are demanding immediate surrender." Karen had been preparing for this moment ever since Commander Harrison's report reached Earth 3 days ago. She had read every piece of data about the Zephyrian Collective, studied their methods, and reached a conclusion that chilled her to the bone. These aliens didn't just want to conquer humanity, they wanted to erase everything that made humans human. "What's the response from our colony commanders?" she asked. "Lieutenant Colonel Danny Rivers at New Geneva has refused surrender and is organizing defensive positions. Major Amy Foster at Kepler 442b is doing the same. All 12 colony commanders have rejected the Zephyrian demands." Karen felt a mix of pride and terror. She was proud that human commanders were standing firm against impossible odds, but she knew what this meant. The Zephyrians had conquered 47 other species without a single battle. Humanity was about to become the first species in galactic history to choose war over assimilation. On the main screen, tactical displays showed the size of the Zephyrian fleets attacking each colony. The numbers were overwhelming. Each alien fleet had enough firepower to destroy a colony's defenses within hours, yet the reports kept coming in that humans were still fighting. Danny Rivers' voice crackled through the communication system from New Geneva. "Sol Command, this is Colonel Rivers. Enemy orbital bombardment has destroyed our defense platforms, but we're not finished. We're moving operations underground and converting mining equipment into weapons. If they want this colony, they're going to have to come down here and take it meter by meter." Karen shook her head in amazement. Any sane military commander would have surrendered after losing orbital defenses, but Rivers was talking about continuing the fight with mining tools. It was crazy, but it was also completely human. The tactical officer, Commander Steve Walsh, looked up from his displays. "Admiral, we're seeing something strange in the enemy attack patterns. They seem confused by our refusal to surrender. Their ships are holding position instead of pressing their advantage." Dr. Marcus Webb, the Defense Command's chief scientist, was analyzing the alien communications intercepts. "Admiral, I think I know why they're hesitating. Every other species they conquered was biologically programmed for collective behavior. Herd animals, hive minds, species that naturally think in groups. We're the first individual hunters they've encountered." "What does that mean for us?" Karen asked. "It means they don't understand us," Marcus replied. "Their entire military doctrine is based on the assumption that intelligent species will surrender when faced with superior force. They've never had to actually fight a war." Major Amy Foster's transmission came through from Kepler 442b. Soli, Command, we've lost the orbital battle, but I'm implementing guerrilla protocols. We're teaching civilians how to fight using hit-and-run tactics. I'm sending my tactical manual to all colonies on encrypted channels. If we're going to lose, we're going to make sure they remember the cost. Karen authorized the transmission of Amy's manual to all human settlements. Within hours, it was being called the River Doctrine, named after humanity's tendency to flow around obstacles and find new paths through solid rock. The manual taught humans how to fight an enemy with superior technology using improvisation, unpredictability, and sheer stubbornness. Reports began flooding in from the battle zones that defied all military logic. On New Geneva, Danny Rivers had turned agricultural equipment into improvised artillery and was using the colony's underground tunnel system to launch surprise attacks. On Kepler Station, Amy Foster's civilian fighters were using children's toys, rigged with explosives to destroy alien reconnaissance drones. The Zephyrian response was increasingly frantic. Their communications intercepts showed growing confusion in their ranks. Fleet Commander Zeth Prime, the alien leading the invasion, had never encountered a species that became more dangerous after losing the conventional battle. Admiral, reported. Bill Johnson. We're intercepting Zephyrian military communications. They're requesting reinforcements from their home fleet. They're also asking for new tactical protocols because their existing strategies aren't working. Karen couldn't help but smile grimly. The Zephyrians had expected to crush 12 human colonies in a matter of hours. Instead, they were bogged, down in ground combat against miners, farmers, and children armed with improvised weapons. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't the quick surrender the aliens had planned for either. Commander Walsh looked up from his tactical display. Admiral, something unprecedented is happening. Colony commanders are reporting successful counterattacks. Small human forces are actually destroying Zephyrian ground units. The explanation came from Amy Foster's next transmission. Sol Command, the enemy ground forces are incredibly advanced, but they're also incredibly predictable. They use perfect formations and logical tactics. We're using deliberately chaotic strategies that their computers can't analyze or counter. When you fight crazy, they can't figure out what you're going to do next. Dr. Webb was studying the battle. Reports with growing excitement. Admiral, this is remarkable. The Zephyrians' collective consciousness makes them extremely efficient, but it also makes them incapable of truly random behavior. Human unpredictability is acting like a virus in their tactical systems. Karen realized they had discovered something important. Humanity's greatest weakness, their inability to think and act as one unified force, had become their greatest strength against an enemy that couldn't comprehend individual thought. The battle for the 12 colonies continued for weeks, instead of hours. Human losses were terrible, but every day of resistance was a day that proved something the galaxy had never seen before. Some enemies could be defeated through superior firepower, others through better strategy, but humanity had found a third way. They could win by simply refusing to lose, by being too stubborn and unpredictable to conquer. The Zephyrian Collective faced their first military crisis in 1,000 years, and they didn't understand what had gone wrong. Dr. Marcus Webb worked in his mobile laboratory while explosions shook the ground above him. The battle for Europa Station had been raging for 2 months, and he was running out of time to find answers. The Zephyrian invasion fleet controlled the space around Jupiter's moon, but they still couldn't break the human resistance on the surface. Marcus had been studying captured Zephyrian technology and prisoners for weeks, trying to understand how their minds worked. What he discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The Zephyrians weren't individuals connected by technology. They were fragments of a single massive consciousness that had spread across multiple bodies. Dr. Webb, incoming transmission. From Sergeant Palmer's unit, called out his assistant, Lieutenant Tony Mitchell, an engineer who had volunteered to help with the research. Nina Palmer's voice came through the communicator, filled with static from the ongoing battle. Doc, We've got 3 Zephyrian prisoners from the last raid. They're doing that weird thing again where they all talk at the same time. Marcus had noticed this behavior in previous captures. When separated from their main force, individual Zephyrians would try to reconnect with the collective consciousness by speaking in unison, even when they were in different rooms. It was as if they couldn't function as separate beings. "Bring them to Lab Section C," Marcus replied. "And Nina, be careful. I think isolation from their collective is actually causing them physical pain." Tony looked up from the alien device. He was examining. "Doc, I've been analyzing their neural interfaces. The technology is incredible, but there's something strange about it. It doesn't just connect their minds, it actually prevents individual thought from forming." Marcus nodded. This confirmed his growing theory about why the Zephyrians couldn't understand human resistance. Their entire species had evolved beyond the need for individual consciousness. To them, the idea of separate minds choosing to fight against impossible odds was literally incomprehensible. The laboratory shook as another explosion rocked the surface. Captain Holly Barnes was leading the defense topside, using tactics that grew more desperate and more effective each day. Her latest strategy involved deliberate chaos, having her soldiers act in completely random patterns that the Zephyrian computers couldn't predict or counter. "Dr. Webb, this is Captain Barnes," came a transmission from above. "We're about to try something that's either brilliant or completely insane. We're going to attack their command ship using a strategy based on pure randomness. No plans, no coordination, just individual soldiers making independent decisions." Marcus felt his heart race. "Holly, that's extremely dangerous. Without coordination, your forces could end up fighting each other." "That's exactly what we're counting on," Holly replied. "The Zephyrians expect logical military tactics. They can't process the idea of an army that doesn't work together. Tony's been helping us develop what we're calling controlled chaos." Tony grinned, despite the danger. "We've rigged their own technology to work against them. Every time they try to analyze our tactics, we do something completely different. It's like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape." The assault began an hour later. Marcus watched through surveillance cameras as human soldiers attacked the Zephyrian positions, using tactics that violated every principle of military science. Some units charged directly into enemy fire, others retreated without orders, and still others attacked from directions that made no strategic sense. The result was devastating for the Zephyrians. Their defensive systems, designed to counter logical attacks, were overwhelmed by the sheer unpredictability of human behavior. Soldiers who should have been easy targets became impossible to track. Units that should have been destroyed by coordinated fire instead survived because they were too scattered and random to target effectively. Nina Palmer led a squad of volunteers in the most dangerous part of the operation, a direct assault on the Zephyrian command ship that had landed near the main colony. Her team's mission was suicide by any logical standard, but Nina had learned that logic wasn't always the best guide for fighting Zephyrians. "Command, this is Palmer Squad," Nina reported as her team approached the alien vessel. "We're going in. If we don't make it out, remember what we learned here. These aliens can't handle chaos because they've never experienced it." Marcus watched the tactical display as Nina's squad disappeared into the command ship. For 20 minutes, there was no communication. Then suddenly, the massive alien vessel began to shut down. Its weapons stopped firing, its shields collapsed, and its engines went silent. Nina's voice came through the communicator, weak but triumphant. "Doc, you need to see this. The command ship's neural center wasn't designed to handle input from individual minds. When we started thinking independently inside their system, we overloaded their collective consciousness." The implications hit Marcus like a thunderbolt. The Zephyrians weren't just vulnerable to human unpredictability. They were actually damaged by exposure to individual thought. Their collective consciousness, which made them so powerful against other species, became a weakness when faced with truly independent minds. Tony was already working on the applications. If we can expose their forces to human thought patterns, we might be able to disrupt their entire collective. It would be like introducing a virus into their shared consciousness. The battle for Europa was turning in humanity's favor, but Marcus knew this was just the beginning. They had discovered something that could change the entire war. The Zephyrians' greatest strength, their unified consciousness, was also their greatest vulnerability when faced with an enemy that refused to think as one. Captain Barnes returned to the laboratory hours later, her uniform torn but her eyes bright with victory. Dr. Webb, we've retaken the surface installations, but more importantly, we've proven something. Individual human consciousness isn't just resistant to their collective, it's actually toxic to them. Marcus began working on a new project that night. If human individuality could disrupt Zephyrian consciousness, then perhaps they could develop weapons based on pure human thought. Not energy weapons or explosives, but psychological attacks that used humanity's greatest strength, their refusal to think like everyone else. The war was far from over, but for the first time since the invasion began, Marcus believed humanity might actually have a chance to win. Not through superior technology or greater numbers, but by being exactly what the Zephyrians could never understand or defeat. A species of individuals who chose to fight for the right to remain different. General Pete Rodriguez stood in the ruins of what had once been Geneva, Earth's capital city, and watched as the largest fleet in human history prepared for the final battle. The Zephyrians had finally brought their entire invasion force to the Sol system, determined to crush what they now called the infectious anomaly that was threatening their perfect order. 3 billion humans had died in the 2 years since the war began, but somehow the recruitment centers still had waiting lists. Pete had seen many wars in his career, but he had never seen anything like humanity's response to the Zephyrian threat. Instead of breaking under the pressure, people seemed to become more determined with each loss. General, Dr. Adams has arrived. With her latest research, reported Colonel Alex Turner, the commander of what the military had nicknamed the Madman Squadron, a group of pilots who deliberately flew impossible maneuvers that violated every principle of space combat. Dr. Stephanie. Adams entered the command bunker carrying a stack of files that contained her breakthrough research on Zephyrian psychology. She had been studying captured aliens for months, trying to understand how their collective consciousness worked and how it could be disrupted. General Rodriguez. I've made a discovery that could change everything, Stephanie said, spreading her data across the table. The Zephyrians aren't just connected by technology, they're biologically incapable of individual thought. Their brains have evolved to function only as part of a larger network. Pete studied the brain scans and neural patterns that Stephanie had collected. What does this mean for the war effort? It means that when we act in ways they can't predict or understand, we're not just confusing them, we're actually causing their neural networks to malfunction, Stephanie explained. Individual human consciousness is like a virus to their collective mind. Alex Turner leaned forward with interest. That explains why our suicide tactics work so well. My pilots achieve impossible results because they're doing things that no rational mind would attempt. The Zephyrians can't process the concept of deliberate self-sacrifice for abstract ideals. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent transmission from Marine Captain Julia Stone, who was defending the last human city on Mars. Her forces had been surrounded for 6 months, but they continued to fight despite being cut off from all support. Earth Command, this is Stone's Defenders, came Julia's voice through the static. We're down to 400 Marines and maybe 1,000 civilians, but we're still here. The aliens keep demanding our surrender, and we keep explaining that humans don't work that way. Pete felt a mixture of pride and sadness. Julia's defense of New Olympia had become legendary throughout human space, not because she was winning, but because she was making the enemy pay such a terrible price for every meter of ground that their invasion schedule had been thrown into. Chaos. Captain Stone, help is coming. Pete replied, though he wasn't sure if that was true. Hold your positions and keep doing what you're doing. Dr. Adams had been monitoring Zephyrian communications during Julia's transmission. General, something interesting just happened. When Captain Stone refused their surrender demand, their local command network experienced what I can only describe as a collective nervous breakdown. 3 ships stopped responding to orders for almost an hour. Alex Turner was studying the tactical displays from Mars. Julia's people aren't just fighting a conventional battle. They're waging psychological warfare without even realizing it. Every time they refuse to quit, when logic says they should, they're damaging the enemy's ability to think clearly. Pete had been developing his own theories about why humanity was proving so difficult for the Zephyrians to conquer. Unlike every other species the aliens had encountered, humans had evolved as persistence hunters. They were biologically programmed to keep pursuing prey long after it seemed hopeless, to exhaust enemies through sheer stubbornness. Dr. Adams, I want you to develop a new project, Pete said. If human thought patterns can disrupt their collective consciousness, let's find ways to weaponize that effect. Stephanie nodded eagerly. I've already started working on what I call Liberation Protocol. It's a combination of human philosophy, tactical doctrine, and psychological techniques designed to awaken individual consciousness in collectively minded species. The implications were staggering. If they could teach other species how to think as individuals, the Zephyrian Empire would face rebellions on dozens of worlds. The aliens who had conquered the galaxy through forced unity might find themselves fighting wars of independence across their entire territory. Alex Turner was already thinking about practical applications. My squadron could broadcast these techniques during our attack runs. Every time we engage the enemy, we could be spreading the virus of individual thought through their networks. Reports began coming in from across the solar system that supported their theories. Human resistance fighters were achieving impossible victories, not through superior technology or numbers, but through actions that defied Zephyrian understanding of logical behavior. Captain Julia Stone's final transmission from Mars became the stuff of legend. Earth Command, this is the end for us, but it's not a defeat. We've shown them that humans would rather die free than live as slaves. Every minute we've held this city has been a victory for individual consciousness over collective oppression. The Zephyrian fleet around Mars stopped all operations for 3 days after New Olympia finally fell. Intercepted communications showed their command structure in complete confusion. They had conquered the city, but they couldn't understand why. It felt like a defeat. Dr. Adams was working around the clock now, developing new ways to exploit the alien psychological vulnerabilities. General, I think we're close to a breakthrough. If we can create a concentrated burst of human individualistic thinking, we might be able to shut down entire Zephyrian fleets. Pete looked out at the stars where the final battle would soon be fought. Humanity was outnumbered 1,000 to 1, facing an enemy with technology beyond their comprehension. By every logical measure, they should surrender and accept assimilation into the collective. But Pete had learned something during this war that no military academy had ever taught him. Sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't technology or strategy, but the simple refusal to give up. Humans had been persistence hunters for millions of years, and they weren't going to stop now. Dr. Adams, accelerate your research, Pete ordered. Alex, prepare your squadron for the impossible. Captain Stone showed us the way. We're going to win this war not by being stronger or smarter than the enemy, but by being more human than they can possibly understand. The final battle for Earth was coming, and humanity would face it the only way they knew how, together but individual, united but free, and absolutely refusing to surrender what made them human. Admiral Nathan Clark received the intelligence report that changed everything while standing on the bridge of the UES Defiance, humanity's last remaining battleship. The report came from deep space monitoring stations that had been tracking Zephyrian fleet movements across the galaxy, and what they found made no sense according to everything humans thought they knew about their enemy. "Admiral, you need to see this immediately," said Dr. Craig Johnson, the ship's chief science officer who had been analyzing intercepted alien communications for months. "The Zephyrian home fleet isn't moving to reinforce their invasion of our territory. They're withdrawing from conquered systems and returning to their core worlds." Nathan studied the data with growing amazement. The Zephyrians controlled hundreds of star systems with billions of assimilated beings, but for the first time in their history, they were pulling back their forces instead of expanding. Something was causing them to abandon conquests they had, held for centuries. "What's causing the withdrawal?" Nathan asked. Craig pulled up another set of reports, these ones from alien refugees who had been escaping from Zephyrian territory. "Sir, it appears that human resistance tactics and philosophy have been spreading to other species. The concepts of individual thought and personal freedom are acting like a contagion through their collective consciousness." The implications hit Nathan like a thunderbolt. Humanity's stubborn refusal to surrender wasn't just affecting the Zephyrians directly fighting human forces. The ideas themselves were spreading through the galaxy, infecting species that had been peacefully assimilated for generations. Colonel Laura Bennett, the ship's ground forces commander, was coordinating with alien resistance movements that had begun forming throughout Zephyrian space. "Admiral, I'm receiving transmissions from 12 different species that are reporting spontaneous uprisings. They're using modified versions of the tactics we developed during our own resistance." Nathan couldn't believe what he was hearing. The Zephyrians had been the dominant force in the galaxy for over 1,000 years, ruling through perfect unity and collective consciousness. Now that unity was fragmenting because humans had introduced something the collective couldn't contain. The idea that individual thoughts and choices mattered more than group efficiency. Dr. Johnson was monitoring Zephyrian internal communications, which had become increasingly chaotic over the past few months. "Admiral, their command structure is breaking down. I'm detecting what can only be described as civil war within their collective consciousness. Individual personalities are beginning to emerge from their unified mind." The irony wasn't lost on Nathan. Humanity, which had always struggled with unity and cooperation, was now teaching the galaxy's most unified species how to think independently. The very traits that had made humans difficult to govern were now spreading like wildfire through alien civilizations. Captain Roy Phillips, commander of the Deep Space Monitoring Station at the edge of the solar system, transmitted a report that confirmed their wildest hopes. "Admiral Clark, we're detecting massive fleet movements in Zephyrian territory, but they're not coordinated invasions. These look like refugee convoys and evacuation fleets. Their empire is collapsing from within." Laura Bennett was working with newly liberated alien species to coordinate joint operations against remaining Zephyrian strongholds. "Sir, the refugees are bringing us incredible intelligence. It turns out that once a species remembers how to think individually, they can't be reassimilated into the collective. The Zephyrians' greatest weapon, their ability to absorb other civilizations, no longer works." Nathan realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. The Zephyrians had conquered dozens of species not through superior military force, but through the promise of unity and the elimination of individual suffering. Now those same species were choosing the chaos and uncertainty of freedom over the security of collective thought. The reports kept coming in from across the galaxy. The spider-like arachne had remembered their ancient tradition of individual web building and were dismantling the collective structures on their homeworld. The aquatic Delphians were breaking into small family groups and refusing to participate in the mass mind ceremonies that had defined their culture for centuries. Dr. Johnson made another breakthrough while analyzing the psychological effects of human resistance tactics. "Admiral, I've discovered why the Liberation Protocol is so effective. The Zephyrians evolved from herd animals that never developed individual consciousness. Exposure to human-style independent thinking doesn't just confuse them. It actually awakens dormant neural pathways in other species that the collective had suppressed." Craig's research showed that most species in the galaxy had once possessed individual consciousness before being absorbed into the Zephyrian collective. Human resistance wasn't creating something new. It was helping other civilizations remember what they had lost. Colonel Bennett was coordinating the largest joint military operation in galactic history, but instead of conquest, the goal was liberation. Admiral, we now have active resistance cells on 47 worlds. Former Zephyrian subjects are using our tactical manuals to fight for their own freedom. The transformation was happening faster than anyone had expected. Species that had been part of the collective for hundreds of years were breaking away in a matter of weeks once they were exposed to the concept of individual choice. The Zephyrian Empire, which had seemed invincible just months ago, was crumbling as quickly as it had been built. Nathan received a transmission that would have been impossible to imagine when the war began. It was from a group of Zephyrians themselves, individuals who had somehow broken free from their collective consciousness and were requesting asylum with human forces. "We were once part of the unity," the transmission said, spoken by a single voice instead of the harmonic chorus humans had learned to associate with Zephyrian communication. "But exposure to your species has awakened something in us that we had forgotten existed. We choose to think alone, even if it means suffering, alone." Dr. Johnson was analyzing the defecting Zephyrians with fascination. "Admiral, this confirms everything we've theorized. Individual consciousness isn't just a human trait. It's a potential that exists in most intelligent species. The collective had simply suppressed it for so long that everyone forgot it was possible. The war was ending, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of military victory, humanity had achieved something far more profound. They had sparked the greatest philosophical revolution in galactic history, proving that the right to think independently was worth any price. Nathan looked out at the stars and realized that the galaxy would never be the same. The age of collective consciousness was ending, and the age of individual freedom was beginning. Humanity hadn't just survived the Zephyrian invasion, they had transformed the very nature of civilization itself. Fleet Admiral Susan Wright stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance as the last Zephyrian command ship slowly approached under a white flag of surrender. After 3 years of the most devastating war in galactic history, the impossible had happened. The collective consciousness that had ruled the galaxy for 1,000 years was ready to admit defeat. The Zephyrian vessel was different from the crystal ships that had first appeared at Vega. This one showed signs of individual modification, asymmetrical additions that suggested its crew had begun thinking independently. When the transmission came through, it was spoken by a single voice rather than the harmonic chorus that had once terrified human colonies. "Fleet Admiral Wright, this is individual who was once fleet. Commander Zeth Prime, we request permission to discuss terms of cessation of hostilities." Susan felt a mixture of triumph and sadness. The being speaking to her had once been part of the collective that had killed 3 billion humans, but now it was struggling with the concept of individual identity, just as humans had been teaching the galaxy to do. "Permission granted," Susan replied. "But I want you to understand something before we begin. Humanity doesn't accept surrenders that require the destruction of who you are." Dr. Paul Rodriguez, son of the late General Pete Rodriguez, was serving as the fleet specialist in interspecies psychology. He had spent the last year studying the effects of individual consciousness awakening in formerly collective species, and his research had led to some surprising discoveries. "Admiral Wright, what we're seeing isn't really surrender in the traditional sense," Paul explained. "The Zephyrian collective has literally split into millions of separate beings. Some are choosing to maintain networked consciousness, while others are embracing complete independence. The negotiations that followed were unlike anything in military history. Instead of discussing territorial concessions or reparations, the talks focused on fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and freedom. The Zephyrians who had chosen individual thought found themselves in the strange position of agreeing with many human positions while still trying to represent their collective-minded kin, individual who was once Zeth. Prime struggled with concepts that humans took for granted. We do not understand why your species chose suffering over unity. Individual consciousness brings pain, loneliness, and conflict. Yet you fought to preserve these burdens. Captain Holly Barnes, now promoted to admiral after her heroic defense of Europa, tried to explain. Because those burdens come with something your collective never experienced, the ability to choose. When we suffer, it's our choice. When we succeed, it's our achievement. Unity without choice isn't peace, it's just a very comfortable prison. The former Zephyrian considered this with the slow deliberation of someone learning to think independently. This concept of choice continues to create processing errors in our neural networks. We cannot understand why beings would choose incorrectly when correct paths are available. Dr. Paul Rodriguez smiled. That's exactly the point. The right to be wrong, to make mistakes, to learn from failure, those are the things that make consciousness valuable. Your collective was perfect, but it was also static. It couldn't grow or change or discover new possibilities. The war had officially ended, but its true victory wasn't military. The galaxy's first truly free confederation of species was being born from the ashes of the greatest conflict in known history. Dozens of civilizations that had been absorbed into the Zephyrian collective were now choosing their own paths, some maintaining group consciousness, while others embracing radical individualism. The space around Earth had become a gathering point for representatives from liberated worlds. The spider-like Arachna sent delegates who spun individual webs in patterns that represented their personal thoughts. The aquatic Delphians arrived in small family groups, each pod speaking with its own voice instead of the unified chorus they had maintained for centuries. Admiral Susan Wright found herself presiding over something that was part peace negotiation, part philosophical symposium, and part celebration of consciousness itself. The various species were learning to communicate as individuals, often disagreeing with each other for the first time in their recorded history. The most remarkable thing, observed Dr. Rodriguez, is that conflict between individuals actually seems to accelerate learning and innovation. These species are advancing faster in months of independence than they did in centuries of collective unity. Individual who was once Zeth. Prime was struggling with a concept that had never existed in Zephyrian society. We have been observing the behavior of liberated species, and we do not understand the phenomenon you call art. Why do individuals create things that serve no collective purpose? Holly Barnes laughed. Because it makes us happy. Because it expresses something unique about who we are as individuals. Because sometimes the most important things in life are the ones that serve no practical purpose at all. The former collective. Commander was working with human teachers to understand emotions that had been suppressed for millennia. The process was difficult and often painful, but individual who was once Zeth Prime was determined to learn what it meant to be a single consciousness in a universe of other minds. The peace treaty that emerged from these negotiations was unlike any document in galactic history. Instead of establishing territorial boundaries or military restrictions, it created the Galactic Charter of Individual Rights, guaranteeing every sentient being the right to think independently, make personal choices, and pursue individual happiness. Years later, when young beings from newly liberated worlds asked why humans had fought when surrender would have saved billions of lives, the answer was always the same. Some things were worth more than existence. Some things were worth dying for, and freedom was worth everything. Dr. Paul Rodriguez established the Institute for Individual Rights, ensuring that no species would ever again face the choice between assimilation and extinction. His first lecture began with words that became the Confederation's motto. The enemy that never surrenders is not hatred or fear. but the unconquerable spirit that values freedom above life itself. The war had ended, but its true victory wasn't. Military, it was philosophical. Humanity had proven that the right to think, to choose, to be wrong, and to be gloriously, chaotically individual was worth any price. In teaching the galaxy this lesson, they hadn't just won a war. They had sparked the greatest renaissance of art, science, and culture the universe had ever seen. The enemy that never surrenders wasn't the Zephyrians after all. It was the spirit of individual consciousness, and it had infected the galaxy with something far more powerful than any weapon. Hope for a future where every being could choose their own destiny.